No, this is not the case. Then we go to the last presentation of today. Sarris from the University of Athens will talk about international responses to vulnerabilities of developing countries to food commodity price risks. We are still doing some technical issues, and then the 20-minute presentation can start, so that we have left maybe 15 minutes for discussion. May I ask Alberto, when do we have to finish?
25 minutes or 30 minutes?
Okay.
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 Can I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. This is, I prefer to stand up so that you don't leave. You don't look like cleaning lady, so anyway, this is the plan of what I'll talk about, mostly from the viewpoint of developing countries, but I do want to mention some conceptual issues because I think most people get what volatility is wrong. So I want to mention that, and then I'll talk about whether market volatility has increased, some ways to identify it, and finally, and that will be sort of the kind of new part of my presentation, is what has the international community done to deal with this issue of volatility. Now, the volatility matters for developing countries. Why? Because they are becoming increasingly more exposed to imports of food commodities. So, in this trend, the black line trend that you see is the net trade, which, as you can see, is becoming negative over time. And that means those countries are becoming more food import dependent. And hence, whatever price increases is going to affect them more. And that is actually the more worrying thing from the viewpoint of developing countries. This is the graph for LDCs, but this is the graph for the middle income, what we call the other developing countries. And again, you see that the trend is negative for that line. So all of them are becoming more food import dependent, and hence increases in world prices are going to affect them more. And in fact, what these countries import, they depend mostly on cereals and oils and fats, and the same thing for the net food importing developing countries. Now, I think this is not the same as what causes food price volatility, but it's an estimate of what is going to, I prefer to see them here rather than turn around, I prefer to see you. What are the factors that are likely to affect future grain market volatility? And I think these have already been discussed, so I don't want to belabor this viewpoint. But in terms of conceptual issues, there is a big problem here, because most people look at historical volatility. This is not the relevant concept you should be looking at. And we heard many analyses today. What is relevant for market participants is ex-ante unpredictability. And this is something totally different than ex-post variability, okay? It's easy to measure ex-post variability. It's almost impossible to measure ex-ante uncertainty. But that's what is relevant, because producers and all market actors, what they care is about uncertainty in the future. They don't care about the past. But that's what we measure most of the time. That is wrong. Now, let me, and the risk of agents is determined by the exposure to uncertainty or the unpredictability. Now, let me show you some graphs. These are from a book published recently by FAO. This is a 50-year estimates of measures of historical volatility. Okay, these are yearly measures, and as you can see, there is not much trend over 50 years. So the volatility measured historically hasn't really changed very much. This is for, if I can see well, cereals, and then vegetable oils, and this is for meat products, and this is for sugar. For all of these graphs, you can see, if you measure it historically, which is basically the yearly average of daily percentage changes, something like that, okay? This is the standard measure of volatility. Hasn't changed very much, 50 years. So when people tell you volatility has increased or not, maybe they increased for 2 or 3 years, but not really for 50 years. However, this is a measure of what I was talking about. This is implied volatility, which is a measure of what the agents regard as the future uncertainty, and it's inferred from option prices. So you cannot measure it except only in the organized exchanges that trade options, but you can infer the implied volatility from those. And you can see a totally different trend. Now, according to this graph, the uncertainty that market agents face over time has increased. So those two graphs tell us totally different things. That's why I said it's very important to understand what you want to measure volatility and how you can measure it. Unfortunately, there's not that many markets where options are traded, so it's not easy to measure the ex-ante volatility. Now, this is basically some graph that says that the volatility, this is the historical volatility, because the implied volatility is not easily tabulated. The historical volatility increases with high prices and low stocks. We heard this before, and this is something that works. So periods of high prices are always associated with more volatility. In other words, daily changes, high daily changes. And also, the volatility is positively correlated with open interest. And this is where all this talk about speculators causing high volatility. This is not correct. The research that has been done shows that speculation actually is actually a follow to the volatility. The speculators go where volatility is to make money. They don't cause the volatility, okay? That's what research suggests. So all these things, there is a correlation, but the correlation is the other way from what policymakers think. So I think I want to make this point because most people don't really realize this difference between ex-ante and ex-post volatility, and they look at the historical level, and that is wrong. It doesn't really matter. But then how we deal with the ex-ante volatility is another story. Now, on the EU context, I think that already has been talked a lot. I think if you take a look at this. Basically, what matters in the European Union context is what they call excess volatility, but then we have to ask, how do you measure this? Everybody wants to mitigate excess volatility, but how do we measure it? It's not easy to define it. I will show you just some ideas. All right, now, how to identify it? I think we heard some lectures today, some presentations on how to identify sort of volatility bounds and things like that. And I think these are good exercises. So basically, in a very simple way, the excessive volatility can be defined as the movements of prices or probable movements of prices outside bounds that are somehow deemed to be undesirable and occur infrequently. Now, how do you identify such bounds? Well, I think the concept that should be thought of is a concept that has been used a lot in insurance markets called risk layering. And the idea is the following. If you have the conditional probability distribution of price, and this is what I call this is where the idea of volatility can come from. If you have a conditional distribution of price, then you can talk about a variance, conditional variance, as a measure of your volatility. But if you can see, I have separated this distribution into three groups, into three areas. One, which is the center, which is called the retention layer, namely, this is the volatility for which you don't want to do anything. This is the market agents can absorb it very easily. Then there is another layer, which is events that happen less frequently, but still frequently enough to be dealt with by the market, by insurance or other policies, okay? This is called the market layer. And then there is the highly improbable events. This is the market failure level. It turns out that agents all over the world don't have a good grasp of the very low probability but high damage events. Okay? And this is where the problem comes. There is a market failure there. And that layer is not covered by insurance, or if it is covered, then it costs so much that nobody buys it. A good example is earthquakes. Do you know anybody that has earthquake insurance? I lived in California, which is the highest incidence of earthquakes in the world, and nobody has earthquake insurance. That shows that people, although they know that's going to happen sometime, they think that's not going to happen to me. Okay? And it happens for all events. This is where the market failure level is, and I suggest that this is where the policies should center. In other words, trying to deal with the market failure. The rest can be taken care of by the market, okay, or by individual farmers or agents. If you keep this concept in mind, then I think a lot of things, so most of the policies talked about, both in the EU and other countries, are basically trying to substitute what the market could do. They are not dealing with the market failure level, okay? So that's something that you should keep in mind. Now, you can easily define what is excess volatility, basically axiomatically. I mean, if you think that you want to talk about the probability of price going above an upper and a lower bound, okay, and you want that probability to be low, let's say 5%, then you can define those. But then you have to define the probability distribution of prices so that you can define these variances and then estimate these probabilities. I did a very simple exercise. I mean, this is the idea here, right? You define those layers, and then if price goes around that, whatever the price breaches those bounds, you call that excessive volatility. We did an exercise whereby we did simple, the trend is just a simple moving average, and the variance is the variance computed over the period that the trend is computed. Basically a short period. I think it's historic variance. It's something like 3 years or something like that. But you see that variance is not constant. It changes a lot over time. So if you take a bound, which we define to be 3 standard deviations plus or minus the trend, and say whatever is above or below that is excessive volatility. What does that tell you? You can see in the bottom, in the very bottom, you can see where there are no dots. And these are the periods that this very simple rule identifies as periods of excessive volatility. And you can see that they coincide with the crisis of 2008. Okay? This is a very simple rule. You can't get much simpler than that. All right? With the sophisticated methods that IFPRI and our colleagues at FAO are doing, you can probably do better than that. But what I'm saying is that it is in principle possible and actually quite easy to calculate these periods. This is for wheat. We've done this for maize. Same thing. You can see that you can identify the periods of the high prices, which can be identified with this methodology. So that's not a very difficult thing to do. Now, let's talk a little bit about policies. You know, the idea is, can agricultural market volatility be prevented or lessened? That's what a lot of people have been trying to do. You see, people have been confusing volatility with high prices. Volatility is not high prices. Volatility is variability, it's changes, very frequent changes up or down. Okay, but what people think is high prices, not changes, okay? Which is something we should get them to stop thinking about. Now, the major determinants of volatility are shocks to production, border and domestic policy, stockholding behavior, and I think these have already been mentioned here. But it's very difficult to prevent this type of behavior, okay? And so it's very difficult to prevent food price spikes. You cannot control the market very easily. In fact, I remember when some proposals on volatility, especially this virtual stocks proposal, which I'll talk a little bit about, that became kind of fashionable for people to talk about. I was talking to some traders, say, we love it. We'll eat up whatever money you put in there. We'll eat it in a day. You cannot beat the market. The market is very, very strong. So, and I think this has been learned by experience. So, the better thing is, if you want to influence volatility, is to influence the national policies that are causing it, namely go back to the causes of the volatility and try to influence those rather than try to prevent the market from doing what it does. Everybody that's trying to play with the market, usually countries have gotten burned and they have spent a lot of money, usually money thrown down there. What can lower the probability of excessive spikes? Better information. That's one thing that everybody accepts would be a good idea. A global early warning system, if you can put one, to prevent export bans. I think we already talked about that. Stock policies can, in principle, lower volatility if you can do it properly, but the problem is that you cannot really do it properly most of the time. Why is that? Because you need agreement. If you do an international system, you need agreement on the allocation of stocks, you need rules for release, you need rules for financing and all that stuff. Everybody that says we need stocks, we need the rules that govern the stocks. And once you start talking about the rules, then you have to see how the market will react, and usually there is a substitution of private for public stocks. It becomes very complicated. I did an analysis of this back a long time ago. I spent 2 years doing a simulation model for Ghana, and it turned out that it didn't have any effect because basically the private stocks were substituting for public stocks. So it is not an easy to do this, and that is why only if you have a lot of resources and there is imperfections in the market, like there exist in some developing countries, you can do it. But developing countries are the ones that don't have the money to throw in this. While in developed markets like the EU, which has lots of money to throw into policies that don't work and did it, they don't work, okay? And so anyway, what I'm saying is that national stock policies, if accompanied by appropriate rules of operation and management, can maintain stability. The problem is most of the times people talk about stocks without talking about the rules of operation. You need the rules of operation. Okay, when do you release stocks? When do you buy them? And you need an agency to do this properly. The Asians have done it properly and they have managed to stabilize domestic markets. The EU did it with some rules. Of course, the rules were fairly inefficient. We accumulated lots of stocks, but that's another story. There is other stock-related policies. This idea of virtual reserves was based on a premise that basically the cash prices are caused by the futures prices. Now, that's a rather outlandish proposal that was supported by some empirical evidence that seems to everybody I talk to. I'm not an expert on the futures and options market, but seems like not a proper proposition. But then the idea was to influence with intervention the futures markets, not the cash markets. And the idea is that if you stabilize the futures markets, you can stabilize the cash markets. Well, this is where the quote from the traders comes in. If you put, they were talking about $20 billion, into this, they said, fine, do it. We will eat it up in a day. They will go against the market and they will eat it up. This is actually a very dangerous policy, so I don't really think it will work very well. It's very costly. Now, emergency physical reserves is a way to at least ensure the minimum flow to some most affected countries. So these are policies that may work. Now, commodity exchanges, everybody talks about, at least in the US, about I'm only 15 minutes. You gave him half an hour and you gave me 20? This is asymmetry. Let me finish my presentation. Okay. In the US, the talk has been about reforming commodity exchanges and basically by limiting the volume of speculation. But the problem is you don't know what speculation is, you don't know how much speculation there is, and it's not clear how you can limit it. These are very sort of nice rules, but then when you start talking about limits to contracts, limits to positions and all that stuff, it's not easy to do it. And actually, the exchanges have been operating for many years and they've been fairly efficient. They don't seem to be very inefficient, at least in the US and the organized exchanges. So the point is that speculation really is a symptom, not a cause of spikes. And this is the basic point that you want to keep in mind. Now, the real policies to assist developing countries, and I'm saying this because then I'll tell you what the international community has done vis-a-vis what is the proper policies. The proper policies are to help them hedge the food import risks with options and futures, if they can, and then assure that they have import financing when they need it, and do safety nets. These are policies that may actually work if they are available. Now, let's see where the international, I just briefly have a slide here on the WTO because people think that WTO can do something about volatility. The basic point is at the bottom here, WTO cannot do anything on volatility. It's not designed to do anything on volatility. And the only thing that it could do, namely prevent export bans, it doesn't do. So it cannot really do anything on volatility. Now, how has the international community reacted to this thing? I have 5 minutes here, so that please, if you give me 5 minutes, I will finish it. I'll take 5 minutes. Okay. So, interestingly, everybody was concerned. It all started with 2008 with the World Food Summit at FAO. And then everybody was very concerned. And the conference did acknowledge the world's food system vulnerability to the shocks and resolved to help make the system more resilient. That was written in the conference proceeding, very nice. So the point is that the governments, then it became an issue that should be dealt at the highest level and then filtered down through the ranks to actual policies. And the institutions that exist to do that are the G8, the G20, the European Union, WTO, etc. And so one could follow to see whether in those type of fora there has been any development, and this is what I do here. So follow up to the Rome 2008 summit. there was the famous L'Aquila Summit in 2009, and the initiative, which received a lot of attention and a lot of publicity, aimed at achieving sustainable global food security by promoting agricultural production and productivity, investments, emergency relief strategies, rural and economic-wide growth, and so forth. A big, big agenda, but a big commitment at a very high level to do something about it. And in addition to that, the G8 countries pledged that they were going to spend more than $20 billion to help causes. And actually they did end up spending those. Actually most of that has been spent, not just committed or pledged, but has been spent. So that is an interesting positive reaction. Now, concerning food price volatility, explicitly the L'Aquila initiative supported cash-based social protection systems, targeted nutrition interventions, and called for removal of export restrictions and consultations to advance such restrictions. And asked for a system of stockholding to deal with humanitarian crisis, not to do stabilization, but basically to help smooth the emergency aid flow. That was the idea, and that's a correct idea, if they can do it, but they didn't do it. Now, then after the L'Aquila 2009, you had the G20 Seoul and the road to the summit in Cannes. And again, you have a reaffirmation of these goals in the G20 in Seoul, which discussed the initiative, they reaffirmed the goals and all that stuff. But then the real interesting summit was in Cannes, which was led by France, and France took a real interest in dealing with this issue very much. And as a background to that, there was an interagency group that was formed. I think, is George here? Yes, George was a member of that group from FAO. So if there's anything wrong with that declaration, blame him, because he participated in the drafting of that very interesting report, very comprehensive report, which proposed these measures that I have here. They talked about productivity, they talked about establishment of market information system, transparency, improving market access, defining critical food shortages as a precondition for allowing export restrictions, removing subsidies, supporting food emergency reserves, and so forth. These were explicit in the report. They were not all adopted in the famous Cannes meeting of the G20 in France. Although France pushed for most of them, they adopted a limited subset of those proposals. The proposals were very nice, very correct, and very appropriate for the problem, but they were not adopted by everything. They sort of adopted a limited agenda, and they launched the agricultural market information system and something else called GeoGLAM, which is a monitoring system of, or a coordination of the satellite monitoring systems around the world. These are technical issues. The problem is that they did not put any money behind those things. Okay, they made the declarations, they adopted the things, but no real money, no real cash. So then after that, after follow-up in cash, the AMIS was established, but the AMIS was already there. It was just enhanced a bit, and I had the good fortune of being the director of the division that where AMIS is currently now, and it was already there, and it was operating. It was just given another name. It was scooped up, you know, given a new dress, but basically some funds, but not really enough to do what was supposed to do. Then the US and the EU tried to draft new financial market regulations. This didn't go anywhere, because I think at the end they realized that the markets were okay. They didn't really need to do very much about those. And then there was Camp David in 2012, New Alliance of Food Security. That's sort of another initiative that President Obama initiated. And again, there was a reaffirmation of some of those commitments and so forth. The new thing was the participation of the private sector now in all these things and not just government-led things. Now, interesting enough, that G8 declaration in 2012 mentioned specifically the management of risk and the institution of a system to help countries deal with the risks they face. That's a new initiative. And actually there was a follow-up to that. After that, there was 2012 in Los Cabos, and I just described what happened. They reaffirmed the declarations earlier, but again, they didn't commit any new funds. And then we arrive President Hollande made a very interesting proposal in December 2012, which is a system of global stocks. I'm sure, Frank, you may have had something to do with this, but that didn't go anywhere. So far, the countries have not supported President Hollande. And then the following up high-level meetings, G8 in Louvre-Erne and then in St. Petersburg late last year, they reaffirmed commitment to food security, but again, no new funds, okay? So lots of talk, a lot of interesting commitments, but no real new money. So the final thing is the WTO ministerial meeting in Bali this last December, which accepted and agreed a limited agreement on stocks. But this was at the insistence of India, who wanted the stock building that they have not to be counted against their aggregate measure of support commitment. So they managed that for a limited period of time. So that was something. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is compensatory financing arrangements. And the only ones that exist right now, the real ones, are the IMF, the extended shocks facility, which has been operational for some years. And has been superseded recently by the so-called standby credit facility. And this is supposed to give credit to countries that have balance of payments problems because of commodity shocks, okay? But it follows the standard IMF conditionalities and all that thing. So countries don't like it so much. The only other thing that exists is the EU Flex. Now it's called VFlex for vulnerability flex. But that has never been a good system because that does not compensate ex ante but ex post, and it takes a long time to figure it out. And usually it's a counter-cyclical thing. Okay, so.
Okay, I think now.
Yeah, I'm finished. Here's the conclusion. So the issue of supporting food-dependent, low-income developing countries to deal with unexpected food shocks has been actually relatively high on the agenda, but not much has been accomplished in terms of additional resources. And the reason may be that the most vulnerable of these countries don't have a real say in setting the agenda in those meetings. These are high-level developed country meetings. The developing countries don't have much of a say. And, but with declining world food prices, the risk is that this issue is not going to come anymore on the agenda of high-level meetings, and it's not going to receive the emphasis. This is exactly what happened in past crises. After the crisis passed, those things did not stay high on the agenda. Nevertheless, there has been some developments. AMIS has been established. There's been a little bit of money. You know, there is a group that tries to help countries with risk management that has been established. So there have been some limited developments, which shows that the international community did react this time much better than last crisis to this world food crisis, and hopefully they will have some more to do in the near future. Okay, thank you very much.
So I assume the tacit agreement that you would like to listen until the end of the presentation. Sorry? No, that was fine. I was talking to the audience. Nobody left. So that was you. Okay. We have, yeah, maybe Jean, if you could come also. And then we have 5 minutes left for questions. So we start with Adamo. Short question, short answers, please.
Thanks. Adamo Boldi, European Commission. I have a question to Mr. Sarris. I fully agree. We need a forward-looking measure of volatility. Implied volatility is a good measure. Be aware there are people in the room and in ULYSSES project who are dealing with it. Secondly, I agree on the fact that full transparency is not efficient. In the case of public stocks, it's a clear message. In the moment in which rules are set and published, you are kicked out. I agree. The point on which I do not agree, and I cannot agree, is again on distribution. I promised not to talk about conditional variance before entering the room, but it's your fault, so I'm going on this line. Financial markets and commodity markets are affected by a switching regime characteristic in distribution. So we start from normal distribution. We know that the distribution is not normal, and in case of crisis, the distribution on which you would like to make inference, it's even more distorted. This conditional skewness. So every attempt to do something which is aiming at assessing and measuring spikes is based on something which is incorrectly based on past observation. So the measure is, I don't think, is going to work. How would you like to do with it?
You say that the prices are distorted, hence the distributions are not correct or are distorted. Well, the distributions are what they are. Whether they're distorted or not, it's another story. But you're right that the prices, certainly they're not normal, they don't follow a normal distribution. But you have to take that into account whenever you do this. By the way, apart from these simple experiments I showed you, we try to estimate gauge estimates of conditional volatilities. Now, the gauge, of course, is based on past prices to estimate conditional variances. It turns out that they have almost zero correlation with implied volatilities. We tried to do it with several commodities, and we were quite surprised. Maybe we did it wrong, but I don't think it can be that wrong to have almost zero correlation. So that point remains that you cannot use past prices to anticipate future uncertainty. Okay. Now, the problem is, of course, there's so few options markets around that you cannot do this. And that's an area of research. How else can we do it if there are other ways?
Good.
Okay. The next question, please, over there, and then Tarsis.
Thank you. It's also a question to Mr. Sarris, Tjekesdot from Oxfam. The general assessment is, well, the impact on net food importing countries is stated. The solutions are very thin. I had a more specific question in terms of information. We're talking about global safety nets. What is it? What are the perspectives in terms of translating that into policies and into firm commitments?
Yes, the most important aspect of net food importing countries actually is not the high prices, is the trade finance. Because many of those countries have money to import. But you know what happens when they try to import? Usually the import financing goes through the international banks in Switzerland, which finance food trade. And those banks have limits for every developing country. When the prices are high and the country says, okay, I want to import and I have the money to do it, they hit the limit, and that means they cannot import because of those rules. So the idea that has been around for a while is to have a system whereby the international community can guarantee these types of, guarantee the increased limits of borrowing for those countries to finance what? Trade finance. Not for aid. This is not for aid, but just to finance imports. And that's actually a notion that has been well accepted both by the World Bank and the IMF. It would require a little bit of increasing the risk capital. And so far, they have not been willing to consider it. But both the IMF and the World Bank, at least the professional levels, they realize that that is a possible solution to alleviate that particular constraint, which is something probably you've never heard of, but it's a very severe constraint when it comes to high prices. Okay?
And the very last question of today.
Yeah, thank you. Tarsis Nkunzimana from European Commission. I have one question for Jean. I am wondering, with this interesting project that you have, if it is possible to switch a part of your budget and dedicate it to data collection, because as you said, this is the very, very big issue in developing countries. And if you do not have data, I don't know if this kind of project can be sustainable. And for Professor Sarris, I have one question about speculation, very quickly. I have some scientific papers saying that speculation is can be one of most drivers for food volatility. Now we have learned that it is not. It is a symptom than a cause. But my question is, if you look to those guys who can play with buying virtually 1 million of maize metric tons, virtually like this, I think they take risk. And what I have been learning is that if you take risk, if those guys are not stupid, if they take risk, it means that they are sharing this risk with someone. And my impression, I'm afraid that as volatility is dynamic, I think they will impact on volatility in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. First of all, we use and collect secondary data mostly, but occasionally we also collect primary data for our needs. However, the whole idea behind the system, and this is the reason why it is hosted in the agricultural development economics and not in the statistics division, is to show that better analysis for decision making requires better data. And so it's to bring build the continuum from data collection to decision making. And we believe, maybe it's wrong, but by showing the limits also, so it's a bit of the egg and the chicken, you see, limits of the analysis due to data constraints, there will be additional incentive for the governments themselves to actually invest in data. And so that is. Another way to answer your question is also to say that we have a sister or twin projects in FAO in the statistics division this time to also work on data collection. But this takes time because it's all about building capacities in countries. So I think it's a very long process.
Good. Thank you very much for this very interesting session.